So Blue Haven, we're a single family office. The goal was we want to know what every investment is doing. We want it to be something that our kids would be proud of. So we want to think long term. We want to think intergenerationally. We want to think about the downstream consequences of where and why we're investing and who is affected by it. One of the things that also makes Blue Haven unique is that we really try to connect our investment work with our philanthropic work and also civic engagement. I think impact washing is certainly there, particularly amongst some of the larger financial institutions. I think that we're a little later to the game and realized, we've got really large LPs that are sort of asking for it. So let's cobble something together. People just want to feel more connected to what they're doing in the world. And I think that's true of investors too. And so millennial investors bring that into their portfolios. They want to know what's going on. They want to know why things were chosen, if they had a hand in something either good or bad.
Hello, Liesel. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Thank you.
I want to talk a little bit about young Liesel Pritzker, but compared to a lot of people I have on this show, you're still quite young. But you've had an interesting path, and your story starts somewhere in my hometown of Chicago, Illinois. So where exactly in Chicago did you grow up?
So I grew up in the city. When I was in third grade or fourth grade, actually, we moved up north to Kenilworth, so to the North Shore. Went to school there and went to New Trier High School, which lots of people seem to know for better or for worse. But yeah, an alum of New Trier.
What was it like for you growing up in Chicago? I mean, since I come here, I'm interested in your observation.
Well, I think, I think had a fairly normal childhood, except, one thing that's a little different is I was a pretty serious professional actor from a young age. And so a lot of growing up for me was in shows. I was in shows, I was in films, I was auditioning. So that was a little bit different. But besides that, I really enjoyed school. I really enjoyed learning. I had a family that we always traveled a lot. And so I think that also spurred my interest in international development as well, just being able to travel and see the world as well. But yeah, besides the kind of the theater and acting background, I'd say I had a pretty normal childhood.
I usually ask about people's journey, but I'm starting a bit younger with you because of this child acting. I think you started maybe when you were 7 or 8. And for people who might not be familiar with it, I guess some of the more famous roles you had was Sarah Crew in A Little Princess, in the movie A Little Princess, and Alice Marshall, who played the president's daughter in Air Force One with Harrison Ford. That's not the normal trajectory for children that age. So how did that come about?
So I started with my mother had a friend who ran the theater department at a local university called Roosevelt. And they went sometimes when they were doing shows, they, for the college students that were in the drama program, they needed a kid every now and again. So for just kind of random role, I was Child Macduff and in Macbeth, I was, an ensemble member in Mother Courage, just sort of off in the back. And then one year, which I always think is interesting for a college theater department to do, but they did To Kill a Mockingbird, which has 3 kids as the lead. And so I was cast as Scout. And then that production then went to a professional theater in Chicago. And so that gave me a little bit more exposure. And then there were agents and casting directors that came to that show. And that's kind of really what started things. And then was sort of off to the races and kept acting professionally through grade school and high school and a little bit into college. And then I sort of shifted gears when I was at Columbia.
Why did you stop acting?
A couple things. First, I'd been doing it since I was 7. And so, it had been a while that I'd been doing that. And it's kind of a crazy industry. And I also really liked doing theater, which is not that popular with agents. I wanted to go to school. That wasn't a popular choice. I wanted to go to college. Those are all, that's irritating when you're supposed to be those young years. You really want to be kind of getting as much exposure as you can, not taking time off. And so there was a little bit of that. And then also around that time when I was in college as well, I started to have control over my own assets. And I thought, this is actually really interesting what I could potentially do with this investment portfolio, whether it's through philanthropy or investing, but maybe that's actually where my responsibility should lie. And I love theater. I always love it. It's great. But yeah, I just started to want to do other things. And you can't be an actor, certainly not a stage actor, if you don't want it with like 150% of your being. And so it seems like a good time to kind of to retire. That's about 22 or so. And then, move on to something else.
You went to New Trier High School in Winnetka. And all I really know about that is supposedly that was the high school in the movie Mean Girls, or at least it inspired the high school.
There's a lot of, and all the John Hughes movies too, like there's a Ferris Bueller, like there's a lot of good comedies that have come out of the North Shore schools.
You recently received an Alumni Achievement Award there, and I hope that wasn't for being a mean girl.
I hope not. Yeah. Yeah, I hope not. No, I actually really enjoyed high school. I thought it was fun. But yeah, that was kind of crazy to receive that award. That was really fun. Well, actually, the award ceremony is coming up.
Oh, you haven't received it yet?
Not yet. Exactly.
Okay.
But they can take it away at any moment, depending on how this interview goes. So...
Columbia University, that's where you went for studies, and you studied African history. What was your decision to go there, and why African history?
Well, I was thrilled to get admitted to Columbia. And one of the reasons I really wanted to go there was I have a lot of respect for their approach to a core curriculum and really just getting grounded in classics of all sorts. And I just was really interested in that philosophy going into school. And I pretty much knew I wanted to be a history major. I've always really loved history. I've always been also really fascinated by on my mother's side, my grandmother was born and raised in India under, when it was a British colony. So she was English, but, born and raised in Calcutta. And my grandfather was part of the civil service and sort of was moved around a lot of the British colonies in the first half of the 20th century. And I always thought that was just a really interesting, fascinating history. And it's all of its warts and bumps and what different nations do to other nations and why. And I just was totally interested in that. And so I wanted to kind of focus on colonial history and how we kind of tell those stories these days and how does that impact, economics today. And so that was why I wanted to focus on African history particularly. And I thought at that point, maybe it'd be interesting to go into a career, maybe in international development, something around there. That was really what I was interested in. And then while I was there is when Columbia brought Jeffrey Sachs over from Harvard to set up what was then the Earth Institute and kind of a multidisciplinary approach to international development. And so this was in the early 2000s, and there was a lot of talk and discussion around, market-based solutions to international development and poverty alleviation. And so that kind of caught my interest, and I thought that was really interesting. It was right when it was the sort of golden age of microfinance being incredibly sexy and, social business and Muhammad Yunus and BRAC and all of that. And I sort of was very interested in that and started to kind of sink my teeth into microfinance and technical assistance schemes and things like that as I was studying.
I don't know if I have the chronology right, but somewhere along the way, you got some travel work experiences in Africa and India, and you were working in microfinance in sub-Saharan Africa. Is that when you were doing that?
Exactly. So I ended up working at a microfinance, a very small savings and credit group in Tanzania for a while, and then and started just getting more involved at that point, also philanthropically with other microfinance organizations like Opportunity International and Women's World Banking and some other ones as well. So that all right around the time that I was just starting to get control and a handle on investing my own assets. And it was sort of over those years that I was like, well, wait a minute. If there are these sort of market-based solutions and I'm investing in markets, like, what if the two things were linked in my own portfolio?
Was there any story during that time that kind of opened your eyes to the difference investment can make to individuals or a society?
So at that point, so after I was in Tanzania, I took a portion of my assets and I gave it to my mother to sort of run a small foundation, which is still running today. They've just celebrated 15 years, called the IDP Foundation. And part of what she focused on, and a little bit because it was something I was interested in as well, was we started working with a microfinance organization in Ghana to set up with them a program to finance low-fee private schools. So these are schools that are, all over the developing world that are technically private schools because they're not state run and they're not government funded, but they're from a sort of a cash flow perspective, they're essentially kind of a nonprofit with earned revenue. These are not massive businesses that are turning huge profits. They're just trying to educate kids and pay teachers and take tuition. And they're everywhere because there just aren't enough government schools to service these populations. And so what they often do if they need to, they need working capital to pay teachers in advance, or they need to build another block of classrooms, or they need to buy a school bus, they go get a loan. They go get a loan from a microfinance bank. And so the program that I was working on was one of the first programs specifically tailoring loan products to the needs of these kinds of schools. And so what was interesting to me was as we were, continuing to grow this program and we moved out of the pilot phase and really, we're expanding the loan portfolio, you have to go to, capital markets, to the debt providers in order to finance the loan portfolio. And I started recognizing the names of the microfinance investment vehicles that I was, we were trying to get debt from into this program. And at a certain point, I was like, well, wait a minute, maybe not into our specific program, but generally speaking, I can invest in these programs, like in these microfinance investment vehicles that are operating in other places. And, I know what our program's doing and I know how cool it is. And so what else is out there? What else can I explore? But at that point, this is 2008, 2009, going to my, private wealth managers sitting in Chicago and saying, can I invest in frontier markets microfinance was a little scary. And so that was, I think, an interesting moment, just realizing I'm spending a lot of time working on a program that my investment advisors would never let me invest in, even though I know how cool it is and how impactful it is.
So this was the moment when you kind of found some moral dissatisfaction with the wealth managers in Merrill Lynch?
The thing is I think what I was, to their credit, I didn't really quite know what I was asking for. Like, again, it was 2008 when the term impact investing was coined and there's still the universe of what was available was still fairly small. People trying to figure out, is this an asset class? Is it a style of investing? And I think what I really wanted to know was just starting with, what are my investments doing? Like, what are they doing in the world? So what's in the portfolio and what are the nature of those investments? Not just what asset class are they in or what's their risk return profile, but like, what's the thing that they're doing and financing? And the first thing I want to know is what is that? And then, is that something interesting or cool? Is it doing something good? Is it doing something helpful? Or is it doing something hurtful? And most of the time, things are very complicated. And that's fine. That's okay. Like, but the first thing I wanted to know is I just want to know what's in there and what's going on, what's happening. I want to get closer to the impacts of what those investments are. And that kind of started just kind of inquiring and keeping on asking that question. And then you start to see, well, that doesn't actually seem that great. Is there a better option? Is there something, are there, commercial real estate options that are operating in places that are more underserved or have a different kind of approach to how they're being built? Or just starting to ask those questions, you end up, I think, with a different kind of frame on your portfolio. And so that was really where it started.
I believe your great-great-grandfather penned a small book written around the theme of your only immortality is the impact you have on your successors. Is that true? And did that have some influence? Because once again, this isn't exactly normal 20-something thinking.
Well, so, I definitely grew up very aware that I come from a long line of really smart, influential people in business and increasingly politics. And I'm very proud of that heritage. It's really cool. And it's exciting to see what, obviously what my grandfather and my father and uncles have done, but also what my cousins are doing, what their children are doing. It's interesting. And I think we're all really pushed forward by that legacy and proud of it. And I would like to think that, I'm in an extremely lucky position to be an inheritor and, be investing some of the fruits of the previous generations. And I'd like to think that I'm adding to the legacy in some way by doing something creative and doing something a little bit different with it, but just as serious and rigorous as everyone else is in the family around their approaches to business, philanthropy, and politics. We take that seriously. I am a steward of these assets and I take that responsibility really seriously. So it's a little different. I think it's just as interesting if I get it right, if I do it with authenticity and honesty and try to be as rigorous as I can with this kind of a thing.
Especially if you do it with authenticity, because that's not always the element that you find. So that's right around when you made the decision to co-found the Blue Haven Initiative. Is that correct?
Yeah. So what really it was a culmination of starting to understand the landscape of the impact investing kind of world a little bit more. Also starting to understand where what I want in my portfolio hits up against the limitations of your standard private wealth management model. And again, no shade on the private wealth management business. It makes sense and it's a great solution for a lot of people. When I want something that's hyper customized and also has goals that are somewhat not necessarily aligned with the incentive structures of a private wealth management team, it's tricky. It's tough. I'm a tough client to service in that way. And so what we decided was that, hang on a minute, I've got enough resources where we could bring some of this in-house. Let's sort of do a bit of a hybrid model where we do work with team. At this point, we work with the former Imprint team that's now at Goldman Sachs for some fund manager selection. And then we do other manager selection and direct investing in-house as well. And then philanthropy and any kind of catalytic or concessionary investments that we want to make happen in-house as well. And so that kind of works for us so that we're not asking a bank or a private wealth management team to do things that they are just not designed to do or find. We can do that in-house. And so that's worked well for us, but all under sort of the guise of this one single family office.
You sit on the boards of a number of other companies, organizations. The ones that seem notable to me is NatureVest and The Impact and Tonic and Impact Assets, and you dedicate some of your precious time to them. Can you just tell me why you joined those and why they're important for you to devote time to?
Yes, I love these organizations. And I think part of, Tonic and The Impact are both membership organizations, communities of practice and learners. And most of what I've learned, again, I'm an actor, by training. I didn't go to business school. I'm not a CFA. Everything I've learned on the job and from other investors and from asking questions. And so to me, making sure that these kinds of learning communities are super strong and robust is really important. And then, how do we make impact investing easier for lots of people? It should be easy to do. It should be kind of a more standard way of investing. And so some of these other organizations like Impact Assets or the work that NatureVest and the Nature Conservancy are doing, I think help kind of put the infrastructure in the industry and make it a little bit easier for people to do.
Credit Suisse's Viola Steinhoff-Werner, she's the head of Global Next Generation Families Department at Credit Suisse, and maybe you know her. She founded the Young Investors Organization internally at Credit Suisse in 2007. She's called the impending generational great wealth transfer, which refers to all the wealth that will be transferred from baby boomers to the millennials, the biggest transition in global wealth in history. You are a millennial. Tell me to what extent millennials' demands are changing the social and environmental consciousness, and to what extent does that change have a knock-on effect in the asset management industry and become a key driving force behind the development of new impact strategies?
Well, speaking for my entire generation, yes, I do think it's having an impact. I think that, you're starting to see, when I started on my kind of journey, the thought was, it's just her. This isn't a trend. Like, this isn't going anywhere. People just only want to make money.
She'll get over it.
She'll get over it. Don't worry about it. And, kind of business as usual. And then what I think, and actually I think Viola was really smart in starting to say, listen, why don't we actually listen a little bit closer to this next generation? Because, again, client retention is critical to making a PWM business model work. And so you need to be relevant to the next generation. And that generational transfer is when client retention gets tricky. So what are you going to offer the next generation that's something that they want that seems fresh and new? And so I think as millennials started to get older and started to make their demands known, it was clear I was very much part of the pack, asking for, I want to have, purpose in my work. I don't want to separate life and work, those sorts of trends that you kind of see. I want to see my values in little day-to-day decisions. And I want my workplace, right, to reflect those values as well. And so I think there's been a big shift in how, certainly how companies treat their employees, how, for better or for worse, again, maybe over coddling, but it's still something people want to see. They want to see the companies they work for align with their own values. And that also keeps employee retention. People just want to feel more connected to what they're doing in the world. And I think that's true of investors too. And so millennial investors bring that into their portfolios. They want to know what's going on. They want to know why things were chosen, if they had a hand in something, either good or bad. And so I think that, now you see every single large financial institution has at least a team that's, dedicated to this sort of mouthy clients like me that are asking for this and starting to invest in it too. I mean, for Goldman Sachs to have bought Imprint, Macquarie just invested in Sonin, this would have been unthinkable a decade ago. And so I think it's, more than a trend.
It's clear asset managers who don't have something to offer in this regard are going to lose AUM.
Well, and, there's also, I think, a lining up of, there's enough data points now where it's not just, okay, well, we'll throw a couple of funds on the platform because, just to placate these clients. They do well. They don't do bad. You're not going to lose, they're not stupid investments, on their own merits. And so I think now there's enough data where people are like, hey, well, if we won't take a hit and the clients like it, let's do it.
Let's get into Blue Haven now. You guys are doing a lot of things across a lot of asset classes. Can you give me a high-level overview of the Blue Haven initiative, starting with your mission, and what are your main activities and strategies and asset classes?
Sure. So Blue Haven, yes, we're a single family office. So really, me and my husband are the principals. And we don't run any other family members' money at this point, just ours. And that's important because there's lots of different Pritzker family offices. So I speak only on my own behalf. So we were founded in 2012. And as you've mentioned, really the goal was we want to know what every investment is doing. And we would like it to be something at a very, very broad level. Obviously, it's much more complicated underneath, but we want it to be something that our kids would be proud of. So we want to think long term. We want to think intergenerationally, and we want to think about the downstream consequences of where and why we're investing and who is affected by it. And what that is, what the thing is we're trying to affect is quite diverse, actually, because we still like, standard good portfolio practice of diversification. I'm not looking for one impact target in the whole portfolio. We think there's lots of different ways to have an impact, and a diversified portfolio feels like a good way to do that. So the way it works sort of mechanically is we run an investment portfolio across asset classes. From an asset allocation standpoint, it doesn't look crazy, looks roughly like an endowment model, probably with more private investments, but it's not some wackadoo asset allocation. It's actually fairly standard. And we made those determinations kind of the same way everyone else does, right? Like, what are your growth targets? What are your spend targets? What's your time horizon? And how much risk do you want to take? And so with that, we have a broad asset allocation, and then it's within those asset classes and sub-asset classes where things get a little bit different. So we, in the impact space, although there are a few that have started to come around, we're pretty light in sort of traditional hedge funds. The impact investing world just isn't littered with lots of hedge funds. So in a typical asset allocation, you might have a hedge fund allocation. We sort of don't. We kind of substitute other things in and out. So that's one example of something that might look a little bit different in our portfolio. But other than that, what we've then done is kind of marched through the asset classes and tried to find the most interesting investments that sort of hit our risk return targets, but are doing something interesting. And so there's a lot of things in the portfolio around climate infrastructure and deploying solar and wind and project finance and kind of things like that we like. And at this point are relatively low risk. Then on the sort of private equity and debt side, looking for funds that are either specifically targeting, maybe it's digital health, or maybe it's ed tech, or maybe it's financial services in emerging markets. Whatever the underlying assets and companies and businesses are doing are things that we really like. And some of them are self-declared impact funds and some aren't, but I'm not really much of a label person. I just like knowing what's underneath the thing, what's it doing. So that's how we built that portfolio. And we have some investment staff in-house. And then we also do work with a team at Goldman Sachs for some fund manager selection as well, because, it just I'm not going to be better at picking muni bond managers than the team at Goldman Sachs. So what we've really tried to do is focus in-house on sort of specialize in areas that we really care about. So kind of coming out of my own microfinance background, in 2014, took a portion of our venture portfolio and started doing direct investing in-house into fintechs in sub-Saharan Africa. And so we have a portfolio now, I guess 8 years in or so. Oh, almost 10 years in.
There was 3 years of COVID that just...
Yeah, right. Exactly. So that's sort of the investment side. But I think one of the things that also makes Blue Haven unique is that we really try to connect our investment work with our philanthropic work and also civic engagement. So I think, back to being at Columbia and hearing about market-based solutions and things, I think markets are very cool. I think they can do a lot of things. I think businesses can do a lot of things efficiently and scalably, but not everything. And not everything I care about should be touched by markets. Markets can also screw things up. And so a lot of what we try to do is determine, should we be investing in this? Is this a good idea for markets and businesses? And there are a lot of things we care about, like, democracy and civic engagement, that like markets should go nowhere near. Getting young people to vote is not a market problem. So a lot of our activities that are sort of outside of the investment world focus on that.
I've understood that you target market rates of financial return with maximum social and environmental impact. Is that correct?
Yes. We benchmark the portfolio against what we should be getting for that asset class in a traditional portfolio.
The word maximum social and environmental impact, of course, there's like nobody who wouldn't want to do that, but the devil is in the details. So how do you define maximum impact?
So what we do is really look at within each investment, what is it doing and how much of it is it doing? So like, what is the impact of that? We don't do like an effective altruism kind of calculation of like, but if we were to give this dollar away, like, would it have more impact than if we were to invest it over here? Because it's sort of a false, we're going to invest it anyway. So we want to choose the thing that's sort of on the impact frontier, I guess, of what it could be doing. So given the other opportunities that we could have invested in with that dollar, which one gets us to the closest to that frontier that's doing sort of the most good for the most people, given the risk return profile. And that's really just a calculation against a peer set when we're in due diligence and looking at that investment. But it's not a total like, it's not like, well, no, at the end of the day, this dollar should have been invested in cancer research. Like that would have worked, like, because that's just not, we're running an investment portfolio. So that's how we determine it. It's not a perfect science.
How specific do you get? I spoke with Stuart Langdon at Leapfrog, who you might actually know. They define their impact as the number of low-income people that they reach with each fund. And at the time I spoke with them, their target was that the fund had to affect 100 million people, and each investment had to substantially move the ball towards that number. Do you have anything that specific, or is it different with different asset classes?
Exactly. So the thing is that I am a huge fan of fund managers setting those kinds of targets and being very specific with what their goals are in their portfolio. So if we're invested in a climate tech fund, like I want to hear what their point of view is on like what's game changing in terms of, gigatons of carbon removal or whatever it is. If we're in a health fund, how many people are served or are more well as a result of those investments. Like they should have those targets. For us at the portfolio level, we have tried all sorts of different systems to like roll something up into one beautiful target. And every time we do it, it sort of becomes meaningless because that health fund is not contributing to the same goal that Leapfrog is contributing to. And so when I roll them up, like, is it good? Are we on target? Like, we don't know. And so what we do at Blue Haven is we understand fully what our underlying funds targets are. And then we actually want it to be kind of diversified. And then we monitor what those things are. And did they do what they said they were going to do? We are less interested in like investor like in our own attribution. Like, I don't know if it was my dollar or, Temasek's dollar that helped Leapfrog achieve their goal. Like, I don't really care about that. I'm just interested, like being an investor in those funds. Some investors get really kind of, I think, bogged down by attribution. So for us, we don't have one overarching target. We just track what our funds targets are or what we think they should be if they themselves don't have impact targets, or why we invested in them. But no, we sort of specifically didn't say, okay, with this portfolio, we are going to increase literacy rates in adolescent girls. And we're going to look all across asset classes to do that. We thought we can't do that at the portfolio level funds can do it at the fund level or the company level.
I've read that Blue Haven was designed around total portfolio approach and a high bar for returns. Is that the similar philosophy to the total portfolio activation framework, which was written by Trillium's Matt Patsky and the TELUS Institute?
Very, very, yes, pretty much. Right. And the idea is you actually, like, things open up, things become more interesting when you look all across asset classes, because most problems are complex, right? And require lots of systems thinking to get at them. And so, if you care about, you can look at, let's say, here's one thing we're thinking about at Blue Haven as well, just thematically, is air conditioning and cooling, right? So we're in a climate change is upon us. The world is getting warmer. There are more people in it, and they tend to live in places that are getting quite warm, in addition to, populations growing and need to eat things that have to be refrigerated. So the need for better cooling and air conditioning writ large, we think demand's going to go up for that. And we need to have better solutions that are more climate friendly as that happens. So sure, you could invest in companies with budding technologies that are for, different heat pumps, different new interesting technologies in the HVAC area. So you could get a little bit of tech, a little bit of hardware, real assets, built environment needs to get involved, because all of these air conditioners are getting installed as buildings are getting built, and also like passive cooling, like there's all sorts of, so construction and real assets is touching that part of the portfolio. You've had venture, you've got real assets, muni bonds need to play a role in that, where are cities and financing some of these new types of, so you can, just taking a lens of cooling, you could have private equity buying up, mom and pop HVAC shops and retraining them and upskilling them in these new green jobs to install heat pumps instead of traditional HVAC. So you've now touched 4 asset classes just thinking about cooling. And so things like that, and it becomes much more interesting. You can be more creative in thinking across all of these opportunity sets, I think, when you take this sort of multi-asset class approach.
You're investing across 6 asset classes?
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah. Public equity and debt, private equity and debt, real assets. Yeah. Kind of however you want to slice them up. Yeah. For most things.
And for impact, you use the impact management project methodology?
We tend to find that a lot of our fund managers have more robust, have really great and sophisticated systems for measuring. Leapfrog's a great example, right? Like their system for measuring impact is extremely robust and rigorous. So what we tend to kind of aggregate the information that we get from our managers. But I think the impact management project's kind of 5 dimensions of impact is pretty great. Like it's pretty straightforward, and you can make it as complicated as you want, but we want to know, right, what is this investment doing? Who is it affecting? And how much is it doing the thing that it's doing? What is the investor contribution? Like, what is the role of the investor in that? And then what's the risk and the impact risk as well as financial risk? And so I think that's a pretty simple but deep framework to go into. And so we like that at Blue Haven as well.
I'll put a link to that in the show notes. So if I understood you right, the KPIs that you said are at the portfolio level for you, not at the investment level. You leave that down to the managers. We
leave that down to the managers. They usually, honestly, the thing is that what I found over the years is that if your fund managers aren't tracking certain targets that you think are important to track, then you're misaligned out of the gate. Like if you have to superimpose a metric that they don't care about on them, it's not going to work. And so that's just been my own experience. And so we try and get that alignment really key up front.
Can you give me an overview of Blue Haven's theory of change? We've been nibbling at the edges in all your comments here, but what are your impact goals and the outcomes that you're targeting?
So, I'd say our theory of change is kind of more at a systems level. We think that if you can demonstrate and show and be somewhat public about paying attention to the impacts of your investments, you'll end up with fewer problems overall that we need philanthropy to fix. Like if you just are upfront and at the very get-go, what a lot of, what a lot of investors do is spend the first half of their life trying to make as much money as they possibly can, paying no attention to the downstream effects of that impact. And then they do a thing, usually in their 60s, where they say, now I shall give it all away. And they're fixing a lot of problems that they helped create several decades ago. And so part of our theory of change at Blue Haven is what happens if we start thinking holistically from the beginning, from the get-go, and very conscious of not trying to make messes that we have to clean up later, and maybe even have some positive impact along the way. But really, can we demonstrate it's really more of a hypothesis than maybe a theory of change, but can we demonstrate that when you add impact onto the balance sheet, that it is much more cost effective to start measuring your impact right from the beginning? And, you will have less impact to make up for in the future if you start today. And so that's kind of, it's more of a hypothesis. Can we show that that's a style of doing things that isn't completely anti-capitalist?
So there's a tension between qualitative and quantitative?
I think we measure the things that we have quantitative metrics around our impact, but as well as, I'd say our theory of change is more qualitative. It's more a demonstration effect. And then, we can share lots of underlying spreadsheets and things like that. I tend to do that more kind of family to family as opposed to completely publicly. But I'd still say as a family office, we're relatively we're out there.
How do you think about the twin concepts of additionality and intentionality in your investments?
So the thing is that with additionality, for me, as a market rate impact investor with the majority of our portfolio, I'm not super interested if it was my dollar that did the thing as opposed to another LP's dollar that did the thing. We try to be as helpful to our funds and our companies as we can be. So we are not afraid to be early money in. We are not afraid to be very vocal and happy positive references and things like that we have been told by our investees are helpful and additional. But that's a little bit tough to quantify, so I'm a little I think that's just being a normal, good partner. For us, additionality is just a little bit less important at the portfolio level. However, when you start talking about, I think, philanthropy and catalytic capital or concessionary kind of capital, I do think additionality becomes a bit more important. It's also, I think one of the reasons it's less important to me is that I work for myself. I don't have to prove to my boss that it was me that did the thing. So I don't need it for a performance review or to prove to other investors that we're amazing, because I also don't have any outside investors. So I think not caring about additionality is a pretty privileged place. So I don't begrudge people who do. I totally get that. You need to prove why this was a good idea and why the thing that you did added value. So I understand that. We at Blue Haven don't need to do that. So we don't.
You have investments in public and equities and debt. Do you get involved in engagement at all? We
do. We work with services, we work with some, shareholder activists and kind of proxy voting services because I just can't, I am not informed enough to get perfectly in the weeds with all these things, and they can get rather complicated very, very quickly. It's always interesting, for so many years, Facebook was, usually a very popular holding in sort of impact related or ESG related managers, and you could argue, are they destroying a generation's worth of mental health? I don't know, these things get really tricky, but things like that don't show up really in shareholder activists kind of, tends to get a little bit more boring. So the public markets, I mean, impact investors love to, I think, there's many passionate debates about whether you can be an impact investor in public markets at all, or if it's actually the only thing that we should be doing because of this size and scale. So all to say, we work with services that are smarter at that than we would be internally.
Jed Emerson told me everyone's an impact investor. Every investment you make has some impact. It can be good.
Exactly.
Can you give me an overview of Blue Haven's investing strategy and how you actually construct your portfolios?
Well, sure. So, we really start with the asset allocation and revisit that, every couple of years. And then we, depending on, let's say, all right, right now, for example, we are looking at filling in a couple of sort of slots in our venture capital program. And so, we've got a pipeline of funds that have come across the radar, or both from our own pipeline building and then as well as Goldman Sachs. And then we start kind of piecing together, looking what's in the portfolio, what would be additive. We have a lot of concentration in emerging markets because of our direct investing portfolio. So we often look to balance that on the fund side. So we go through kind of a top of the funnel screening. We tend to look for, I would say, our internal investment process. Like, we're more open to first-time fund managers, second-time fund managers than the Goldman Sachs team is, which fair enough. Like, I get that. We rely a lot on their kind of market research on areas where they think are kind of oversaturated or more interesting. They have very good market commentary on, subsectors within. So if we're looking to fill in a financial services or a fintech fund, our payments, overvalued versus small business lending, like whatever kind of their research, our own research. And then we, start talking to the managers within the subset that we find most interesting. And then, depending, so we have our own process internally, that's a pretty standard due diligence, looking at team and strategy and, all the normal stuff that goes in there, reference checks and track record. And then it goes through an investment committee process on their end. So that's me, some of our investment team, and then we have some external investment committee members as well. And, then it either gets into the portfolio or it doesn't. And we, review that once a month. And so that's our, I don't know, I'd say it's a pretty standard, nothing kind of crazy, but it's all in the due diligence process that those questions around impact get embedded. It's not a separate process, or like we don't have like an impact red team or something like that. It's all very integrated into, areas that we want to probe with them in the due diligence process. But we might just have, other questions that we ask around, or that we care about really, around team diversity, around how do they sometimes, some managers where impact is not necessarily completely embedded in their own business models. Like, do they have side letters? Do they have warrants? Like, what are the processes that the fund managers are using to embed impact into their own systems? There's an interesting company called Bluemark that has started that is sort of does impact verification for funds. So kind of will help investors know how good that fund is at their own internal processes of making sure the impact's there. And so that's very helpful. They've a number of funds we're invested in have kind of Bluemark ratings. That helps. Yeah. So, I mean, the strategy, it's a global portfolio, but we do rely a lot on kind of some of the macro commentary that's coming out of Goldman. Cause again, I don't want to sit there and do all of the math around if the Fed does this and that, again, we're not trying to time the markets. We're not trying to be day traders. We're pretty long-term investors. Sometimes when there's a lot of movement or fear in the markets, I've actually canceled some of our investment committee meetings because I think the only thing we're going to do is get handsy on the portfolio, and that's never good for anyone. So yeah, I'd say the only thing we blanket do is, when the market's down X, we buy Y. So we add risk on when things go down. But I get scared. Yeah, sometimes I get scared to have the investment committees because I'm afraid that we'll do something stupid. So
I've heard you say that the climate change theme is incorporated across all of Blue Haven's investments. So how do you do that?
So one of the things I will say is that we didn't set out that way. So we didn't say, oh, it's going to be a climate portfolio. But two things that we've seen kind of have naturally. So when we do really more of like a top down, just sort of like asset class, like manager kind of approach to fund manager selection, what we've seen in the portfolio is that two kind of themes seem to emerge. And one is sort of climate and energy related funds, and then financial services funds. And that actually makes sense to me because those are two things that markets are willing to pay for, right? Like two areas that make sense, right? We want cheap, scalable energy deployed quickly. Markets are good at that, actually. And we want, banks and lending and financial services businesses that can move quickly and scale as well. So like, whereas, you see like, if you're focused on community health, like it doesn't scale. Like it's not a terrific market play. And that makes sense, right? There's bits and pieces here and there. Same thing with like education writ large. There's adjacent businesses that can totally scale. And there are some ed tech funds that absolutely crush it. But generally speaking, investing in education is very difficult because education requires things that markets don't like time and attention and customization. And so I think that's why we've started to see that those two things kind of organically emerge in an impact portfolio that's looking for market rate returns. And so that's kind of what we've found. So honestly, we didn't go in and inject it into each asset class. It was more of kind of like looking at the portfolio and saying, hey, that's interesting. We seem to fall into two camps here. We've got a lot of financial services and we've got a lot of climate energy stuff.
You seem quite honest about knowing what you don't know, and you get plenty of advice and input from people who do know, or at least say they do know. And you've got people working with you, I think, like Generation and Credit Suisse and Pierre Omidyar's group, among, I imagine, many others. At the end of the day, everything you're managing is your money, and all of these advisory people are fee earning. So how do you make sure that you're not going to be misadvised or, in the worst case, defrauded? And has your early career as an actress somehow helped you as an investor?
So, I mean, in terms of being, finding the right partners, I think that I do my best. I hope I'm not getting hoodwinked. I don't think I am, but trying to put some checks and balances in place, I think is really important. So like having a mix of incentive structures, right? Some people that, our investment committee earns a flat fee, but then obviously our investment teams are incentivized, with carry and bonuses and other things like that. I think a mix of incentive structures and a mix of different voices around the table that have different backgrounds. One of the other things that I try to do as well is I'm not afraid to sever a relationship with an advisor if it's not working out. And I've done that before too. So I think you keep people on their toes. I think that can help as well. But in terms of the theater background, I think one of the things that I find helpful, not just sort of in investing, but generally, I mean, really in like any meeting or setting, I find like board meetings, this is particularly helpful, or, you're meeting with a management team or a founding team of, one of the things that you often do in like a scene study class for theater or, different directors like these approaches in different ways is, who has the power, right? In this scene, in this, in this play, in this moment, who has the power? It's often not the person talking. It's often not the person you think you're supposed to be looking for. And it often has nothing to do with what they're saying. And so what do they actually want? And how are they going to go about getting it? And so just sort of trying to get underneath what is this person. So in theater, you call that somebody's super objective, right? Like, what is that person's super objective? It has usually nothing to do with what's on the deck or what the words that are coming out of their mouth. And if you can get to that fairly quickly, and it's not that they're lying, it's just that they think you want to hear about this. And so I find that to be helpful as just a general life tactic and helps you kind of get to the meat of the matter pretty quickly. But yeah, I don't know if that necessarily means I've surrounded myself with the perfect team, but I think we've got a pretty good roster of players on the Blue Haven team.
Could you make it real for me by just giving me one or two examples of investments that you feel capture your strategy and what you're trying to do and how they came on your radar and how you made them, and then what kind of results you feel you were able to make, both financial and impact perspective?
Yeah. I mean, there's some really, we can take, let's see, there's community investment management, CIM. We've been investors in a few of their funds for many, many years. They're US based, but they've just launched an emerging markets fund as well. And they lend to online lending platforms that lend to small businesses. So like think Lending Tree or Lending Club, things like that in the US. But they have a way of sort of creating more transparent pricing with the loans that they buy. They tend to focus in the US on women, people of color, and veteran-owned businesses. And small business lending, even in the US, is kind of the Wild West. Like there's not nearly as many protections on small businesses as there are on individual consumers. And so CIM's approach has sort of been, let's not have stupid, high, and intransparent interest rates. What if we keep things so that people can pay them? And over the long term, we will have more consistent compounding growth. And they have. And so we have seen them just be a beautiful private debt play in the portfolio for many, many years. And now they're launching an emerging markets fund. And we like what the underlying assets are doing and how they're going about doing it relative to other players in the market. So that's one example. And so we're invested in the GP as well as the LP. Then on the direct investing side, a few years ago, we invested in a small Nigerian fintech called Paystack that does payments processing for online businesses in Nigeria. And a few years ago, they were acquired by Stripe, and sort of it was one of the most sort of exciting African acquisitions. And as a fintech investor in Africa, we were like, hooray, that was exciting as well, and kind of played out our thesis in that portfolio as well. And so those are a few things that have been exciting. I mean, there's lots of cool stuff in there. I could go on. Yeah.
You did mention in 2014, you brought capital back in-house from third-party private equity managers, and you launched your own VC arm. And you just mentioned about it, investing in fintech in sub-Sahara Africa. Why did you focus on fintech in Africa?
So part of that came out of, my own sort of experience in microfinance in sub-Saharan Africa. And while I was over there was around when M-Pesa was launched. So the first example of mobile money in the world came out of Safaricom in Kenya, and it just went gangbusters. And, within a very short period of time, the mobile money penetration in Kenya was almost 100%. And it started to spread to other emerging markets as well. And one of the kind of the thesis behind that part of the investment portfolio is you have large, young, increasingly digitally connected populations that are wildly underbanked. You also have a large informal sector that, as smartphones start to penetrate, are increasingly able to become part of the formal sector. And you have the highest mobile money penetration in the world. And so to me, those are all of the ingredients for a very interesting fintech playground. And they're fragmented. It's very tricky. These are tricky markets. There's a lot of Forex risk. There's a lot of dynamics between different geographies. And so we also think it's going to be an acquisition story, not an IPO story. And we also don't think it's going to be like a, blitzkrieg, sort of a big multinational will come in and take out all the players. We really do think, like Stripe coming in, we think it's going to be an acquisition story. So that's the theory there. Starting to see a little bit, but again, Africa's got a lot of macro headwinds, a lot of there was some very exciting investments and new funds coming into the mix in the early part of the pandemic. And then 2023 just has sort of scared everybody for a little bit. So, our time horizon's a little bit longer than I think a typical VC time horizon, but it's exciting to see kind of what's happening there.
No doubt that there's an outsized opportunity there, but this is a region where there's arguably more risk. And you mentioned some of the liquidity risk in thin markets, but also corruption is done on an industrial scale. And this is the primary reason why that region's underfunded. You're doing direct investments, right? You're not going through another fund manager. So how do you manage the risk in this part of your portfolio?
It's a reality. And different markets are riskier on the corruption front than other ones. It's about the management team. It really is. We've seen such a range of tolerance for kind of sketchy sketchy plays. We've seen some management teams with, businesses that are growing really, really fast, and we will not touch it because we just don't think the way they're going about it is going to be sustainable. They're going to crash. Somebody's going to find out, something's going to crash and burn. We would rather have slower, more honest growth, but that's just about, it's really the management team and the board of the company and how they want to approach things. So that's no secret way of avoiding that. It's there. It's a real risk. And we've seen it. We've seen it in our pipeline, and we've seen it just in competitors. So we also need to, if our company is not growing as fast as the competitor, but the competitor is doing it kind of gray market style, are we going to put pressure on the management team, or are we going to say, no, what do we do there as well? So it's constant.
So let's discuss impact and verifying impact and investments impact. You've discussed that I think you rely heavily on your managers when you're assessing that, and you do it at the portfolio level. Do you have an impact report that you publish?
So we don't. We've talked about it. We don't. The only reason for that, so we have internal impact reports, but we haven't published anything, and we've thought about doing something a little bit more external facing. The honest to God reason that we haven't is just simply because we don't need to, we're not selling anything to anybody, we're not. So we have our own internal reports and targets, but we haven't published that. But it's actually, we've talked about maybe we should, because I think back to the original theory of change, of sort of demonstrating that you can do this, I think it would be helpful to be a little bit more public facing on that as well. And I think what I'd like to include in it is not just, here's the aggregate impact of our funds, but then here are the other things that we're doing at the family office level that are outside, kind of using a polycapital approach of, our time and our energy and our networks and things like that as well. And whether it's politics, philanthropy, board seats, what are the other things we're doing that are adding to those impact targets beyond the investments themselves?
One of your most impactful investments that you've stated to date was investing in the youth vote, which was a game changer for climate. So tell me about that. This
kind of realization came out of, I was giving a presentation to a group of family offices, and they had asked me to present on Blue Haven's sort of climate related portfolios. So they wanted to see what investments we've made across asset classes, including philanthropy and including catalytic capital, every investment we've made that touches climate. And so I made this presentation. It's, hundreds of millions of dollars. It's across these, here's all the logos of all the different things that we've invested in and subsectors and stuff like that. And then somebody asked me, what do you think has had the biggest sort of ROI from a climate perspective in your portfolio? And I kind of looked at it and I was like, it actually probably isn't on here. I bet if I were to say it's all of the youth voter turnout work that my husband has done over the last 20 years, getting young people to mobilize and make it very clear to their elected leaders that climate is really important, they've said publicly, I mean, the federal lawmakers have said repeatedly, it was that youth voter turnout in 2020 that got the IRA passed. That's who we felt accountable to. That was the first big thing that we pushed because we knew if we didn't, we would lose their trust going forward. But it was a ton of work to mobilize and you get people to turn out in midterms and get people like, that's something my husband's been working on for a couple decades is how do you get young people invested early and often in their own democracy because they tend to pressure lawmakers to make better long-term decisions. So that's been his theory of change in his own kind of philanthropy for a very, very long time. And he has many projects involved that have helped kind of move the needle.
What's the answer to that question? When you said how, so what's the answer?
There's a few different tactics that he's focused on. One is to get college campuses heavily involved in the sort of civic engagement of their own students. So one project that he started that has now scaled was he was looking for turnout data, sort of campus by campus. He was looking at, what percentage of Harvard students voted in primaries, regardless of who they voted for, but just did they vote in a primary? And that information just wasn't available. Like nobody had really looked at cross-referenced kind of turnout data over campus enrollment data. And so he started a project that would measure that across college campuses and how do you get college campuses to sign up and get buy-in from the faculty. And then what they would do is not only, tell the universities kind of how they did, but then give them a plan to improve it. And you start having colleges compete. So like the Big Ten schools competed for like who could also get better voter turnout. And Northwestern made it a design problem for the engineering school. So at what point during orientation do you encourage people to register to vote? And they narrowed it down to there was like, I think a minute window in one particular part of the first day of orientation that had the highest success rate of when you could register kids to vote and what you needed to do in order to do it. So you make it the college's problem. And you also start to see community colleges have naturally higher voter turnout because they tend to have older and more local students. Education majors vote more than political science majors. Like, it's just interesting. Like the stuff that you would find coming out of that report, you get alumni involved to pressure the schools to do it. And so they found that each college campus, and then you start to study outliers. So some college campuses had an incredible turnout, much higher than pollsters would have thought. And what did they do? And then you learn that, in the college writing class that every freshman had to take, one essay they had to write, they had to go sit in a town hall meeting. And that got people involved. And so little things like that you can do. Another effort that we heavily support and, it sort of gets traction every now and again is lowering the voting age to 16. And then you get high schools involved, which is even better because it's, even more local and you start to get into a culture of voting before you're off into the world. Things like that. But there's been a lot of different efforts that he's supported over the years. But anyway, all of this to say that I don't think you can be a well-rounded climate investor if you also don't care about getting young people to vote. It's helpful. It's very helpful in your climate targets, in your investment portfolio.
So the impact is reflected across your P&L, but this is essentially philanthropy.
Exactly.
That you're investing in society, so to speak. But
right. And there's a few, like Higher Ground Labs is a fund actually that invests in civic tech is the term. So there are kind of startups and tech companies that campaigns use. And so it's a fund that sort of focuses on that. So there's like some things you can invest in that are sort of related to voter turnout, but largely speaking, it's a C3 and a C4 play. So
I suppose we can't have this conversation with you 100% into impact without talking about impact washing. What does impact washing look like to you in the different asset classes you invest in, and how prevalent is it, and how do you protect yourself against it?
So, I mean, sure. I think impact washing is certainly there, particularly amongst some of the larger financial institutions. I think that, we're a little later to the game and realized, oh, hang on, we've got, really large LPs that are sort of asking for it. So let's cobble something together so that, they'll invest in our new impact fund as opposed to an impact native product from a different fund manager. So, but then, so you do see that. But the other thing that I just think it's buyer beware, look under the hood. It's your job as an investor to do proper due diligence and understand the motivations of the team and what you think. And we've also seen some incredible impact products come out of houses that you just wouldn't expect. But because they've been able to hire incredibly authentic teams who are like, oh my God, if I can do this at BlackRock, I can do this anywhere. And they really want to make it work. And they really care deeply about making something authentic because they see the potential if it could scale at that larger firm, then that would be really exciting. So there's some wonderful efforts that are coming out of some unusual suspects in the impact space. But I don't know, I'm not too worried about the greenwashing and the impact washing because I just think any decent investor should be able to catch it. Somebody comes into my office and says, look, guaranteed 50% return with zero risk. I swear to God, it's my fault if I invested that, come on.
You've mentioned catalytic capital as part of your overall activities. Tell me, what is that? And at least what is it for you? And how does it support the other aspects of your overall portfolio and investing activities?
So catalytic capital, and I like that term. Some people are bringing back, I think, impact first capital as well. I think we're all supposed to be retiring concessionary capital. I don't know. We're all very term obsessed. But I like the term catalytic. So as to what it means to me, basically, is these are investments where the returns are not risk adjusted compared to their peer set. Or another way of thinking of it is there is a trade-off. There is a trade-off between impact and returns. And for us in our own portfolio, I think there are circumstances where that's okay. That's okay. A good example of this is in early stage, hard tech, climate tech, right? Where something is an honest to God science experiment and you're not sure if there's even a business model here. It could be a research project. It could be an amazing investment, but an investor that's looking for a risk adjusted return, even in the venture capital space, will say, screw it. I'm going to look at a fintech in Silicon Valley. That's not, somebody else do that. And I'll come in the Series C once you guys have figured it all out. So, but somebody's got to come in the A and B, right? And so that to me is, we could totally lose it all, but it's not even just normal venture capital risk. It's even more. So that would be an example to me of something where it might take a little longer. You're not going to build that factory in 3 years. You might build it in 7 years before you get to the Series C. So your timing's off. It's not a risk adjusted return, but from an impact perspective, it could really make a ton of sense, maybe. And so somebody's got to take that risk, and you just cannot put the pressure on that money that would be in our normal portfolio. You've got to let it do its thing. And so I think catalytic capital is important in the ecosystem, but it's hard to come by.
So how do you decide when and why to make a catalytic investment? What's the thought process there? So
this is, I think the $64,000 question is, what's the difference between a good catalytic investment and just a shitty investment? And the way that we do it. So this is actually where we get a more robust kind of ratings framework where we're looking at, is this market neglected? Is this particular investment sort of scalable, replicable? Is this subsidy, so the trade-off that we're making, is it a structural subsidy or is it transient? Is it like, we just need to prove this and then more money will come in? Or is it like, no, investing in smallholder farmers in very rural parts of Africa is always going to need to be subsidized. You're never going to not subsidize that. So is it a structural subsidy or is it a transient subsidy? For a catalytic investment of the nature that I'm talking about, you want it to be transient or believe it's transient at least. So we have some of these gating questions that we've thought of in a framework. And actually Blue Haven is helping to launch a fund based off of this called the Trintab that is going to be a portfolio of catalytic investments and that have all gone through exactly this kind of screening where we've tried to aggregate them into a pool. Because the other thing that's tricky with catalytic investments is they're all sort of weird and hard to find. And they sort of show up as like bits of some other investment. And so is there a way we can have a dedicated team that's kind of looking for these good opportunities and aggregate them for other investors who'd like to add them to their portfolio?
So is this like a first loss? And like when you do this, are you in providing a subsidized rate and then also taking first loss so you can attract private capital?
It could be. So the thing is that the type of vehicle or instrument that you end up using in a catalytic investment can take a ton of different forms. So first loss we've seen guarantees, we've seen, coming in a junior tranche of in a debt stack, warehousing. So like we do that sometimes with new fund managers that are just getting going and haven't raised their fund yet, but need to start making some investments to get track record. So we'll warehouse funds for new fund managers, things like that. So it's sort of planes, trains, and automobiles in terms of instruments that end up being good catalytic instruments, which sort of makes sense because they're all a little weird.
Could you give me an example of one? And does this link with the rest of your portfolio, or is this independent, standalone things?
So one example of something that we have allocated from the catalytic bucket is we warehoused, as I was saying earlier, so a first-time fund manager, a woman launching a fintech fund, a sub-Saharan Africa-focused fintech fund, and she was getting her team together. We thought she was incredibly smart, had a really interesting point of view on what the market was doing and where it was going, interesting access points. But first-time female fund manager, it's really hard to raise capital, and certainly in that market as well. So we warehoused her first deal as she was, kind of starting to fundraise as well. And so that's an example of like, she may not raise the fund, in which case, that investment in the fund manager doesn't necessarily pay off and it's quite risky, but it does feed into our larger strategy of investing in, we want the fintech ecosystem in sub-Saharan Africa to be as robust as it possibly can. And that means we need more local co-investors. We don't want to just be a family office in Cambridge, Massachusetts coming in and investing. We want more teams on the ground. We want more co-investors, more, just more. And so it's in our interest that we have fantastic co-investors. And so this was an attempt at something like that, but just riskier.
I've understood you target giving away about 4 to 5% a year for philanthropy-based work. So what's the role of philanthropic capital at Blue Haven? And is there a determination that some things just can't be done on an investment basis, or as you alluded to earlier, maybe shouldn't be done on an investment?
Yeah, I would say like sort of learning networks and institution building are things that we focus on philanthropically. So whether it's in the impact investing space, whether it's in civic engagement and democracy building, those are kind of, I'd say, thematically areas we care a lot about. And it's interesting. Ian, my husband's been doing this type of kind of focused on democracy building work for a very long time. And nobody even knew what that was until like 2016. Everyone's like, what do you mean democracy building? Like now people are like, oh my God, I get it. And so things like that, I'd say we focus on philanthropically. And then also just, old holdover from a past life, but theater. We love theater and we support it. And markets, that's a great example of something that is like markets are just awful at truly valuing how much those things matter to communities and to societies. So that's fine. But philanthropy will do it.
So you cover the whole spectrum. You have all these investment funds, and then you have catalytic, and you have philanthropy.
Yeah, we try. That's part of the goal is to try to have eyes on, try to use the tool that makes the most sense for the job and not make our investment portfolio do something that it just can't do, or make our philanthropy do something that it just can't do. Like just try and be honest about the limits, these different types of tools.
You started Blue Haven in 2012. You built quite a bit of intellectual capital by now. You were one of the first ones really in with both feet. You've also built up network capital. Do you have any intention to expand Blue Haven into a profit-seeking entity, maybe something like responsibility, and would be open to taking outside investors?
I don't know at this point. We've always sort of said no to that. We're getting a little bit, people have asked us before, like, would we run other people's money? I'm very extremely aware of the luxury of having the freedom that we have and the flexibility that we have. And I don't know to what degree sort of scale to me is sexier than flexibility. I think flexibility is. And so I don't know, jury's out on that. Not at the moment, but we love like we'd always love to syndicate and work with other people, but I don't know if we'd like properly kind of turn into a trade at this point.
I suppose the argument for it would remove some barriers to entry for other investors who don't want to go and stub their toe and hit their heads in all the places that you have done.
Fair enough.
And it would allow more impact capital to be raised more quickly. So listen, Liesel, I've got a few last rapid fire questions that I'd like to ask you to wrap up our talk here. But if you had to name the single most important challenge in the impact investing space at this time, what would it be and why?
This sort of gunning for ESG is a kind of a weird existential threat that I think more serious than some investors are taking it. I think it actually does matter. A lot of investors kind of brush it off, but I think it's more serious than we think.
It's more in the US than in Europe.
Yes.
What do you know now about impact investing that you wish you knew in 2012 when you co-founded Blue Haven?
I think honestly, it's really a lot of normal investing. Like it's a lot of normal investing questions, just with some extra lens and sort of accountability on it. But the mechanisms are all fairly kind of regular investment stuff.
Can you describe to me an example of an investment that you were convinced of at the time you invested? It ticked all of your impact boxes, but in the end, it didn't turn out. It went pear-shaped. And what did you learn from that experience?
I mean, again, this is nothing earth-shattering, but just I think it gets even harder in the impact space. You have a tendency to throw good money after bad because, you're worried. You're like, you sort of know the beneficiaries at the end of that project and you like don't want to see it fail. So it's harder to cut the ties when you really should. So I would say I have fallen prey to that. I have seen my colleagues and friends fall prey to that. I think impact investors tend to throw good money after bad at a higher rate because you get all tuggy.
Now, the converse of that, can you describe an investment that you were skeptical of, either at the time you invested or maybe you ultimately passed on it and in the end it turned out way better than you thought and you were pleased you invested? Or if you had passed on it, maybe you wish you hadn't. And what did you learn from that experience?
Well, one that's it's a little side to this question, but one that's been a very interesting journey is we've been investors in a company called M-Copa for many, many years, and we've watched them pivot in very interesting ways. And they were a solar home system company. And now what they do is they finance smartphones in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's basically pay-as-you-go asset finance. But the first asset was a solar home system. And this new asset is a smartphone. And they've had various reactions to this shift from impact investors, because at first they were, a climate play, a solar play, and that was exciting. And now a lot of Western investors are like, smartphones, solar's better for those people, not smartphone. And I mean, if you think about what's a more productive asset, a smartphone's a pretty productive asset. Also, they sell a lot of secondhand and refurbished smartphones, which are actually better for the environment than a small solar home system. So this is all to say it's been wonderful seeing the incredible journey this company has gone through as they've pivoted and grown dramatically. But it's all because the management team is still laser focused on serving an underserved customer base with products that they actually need and want and use. And so they've always kept their eye on that, even as they've pivoted over the years. So we've kind of doubled down our investment about a year and a half ago.
So is the lesson learned, the management team is everything? Yeah,
that's the thing. It's things move and you learn things and your assumptions don't always prove to be true. And a good business will listen and listen and listen and pivot instead of, bash customers over the head with things they don't need because a development bank says they do.
If someone wants to get into the impact investing space, how would you advise them to get into the business, and what's the best place for them to cut their teeth?
I mean, I would say, just start doing things. Don't get kind of analysis paralysis. There's lots of terms and there's lots of you can get as wonky and weird and complicated as you want, but just kind of start investing. Nothing's going to be perfect right out the gate. If you're looking for some, it has to have outperformance and it has to target, neurodiverse girls with diabetes in Flint, Michigan. You're not going to find it. Just keep going, just start incrementally and learn as you go. The GIN, the Global Impact Investing Network, has incredible resources. If you're a family office, Tonic or the Impact is a fantastic place to go. There's great conferences. There's SOCAP. There's Catapult Future Fest. There's ones in Latin America. There's lots of stuff to do and people to meet. And it's a pretty friendly crowd, I think. It's a nice group.
I've really enjoyed it. It was great talking to you, and thanks for taking me through all this. It's an amazing journey that you've been on, and I've learned a lot. So tell everyone about your websites and social media and all that good stuff.
Yes. We're bluehaveninitiative.com is our website, and we're active on LinkedIn and Twitter. I am less so. I'm not good at the social media. Trying to get better, but we publish things and on our LinkedIn page fairly regularly.
And I'll put those links in the show notes. And what's the best way for people to contact you?
Through the website, actually, through just info at Blue Haven. There's also instructions on the website for specific, if it's a company or a fund, then it will go directly into our pipeline if you go through the website, as opposed to emailing it to me where it could possibly get lost. So I don't say that to brush people off, but it will actually get reviewed if you go through the website. Okay,
Liesel, thanks again for your time. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.
You've been listening to SRI 360. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe to get future episodes. You can find an archive of all previous podcast interviews and more articles and information on SRI, ESG, impact investing, sustainable investing, and socially responsible investing at our website, sri360.com. If you'd like to read more lessons learned from world-class SRI investors, get a copy of Scott Arnell's book, Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360. It's a must-read for anyone wanting to know more about investing for positive social, environmental, and ethical impact, all with market financial returns. These are the stories and tactics of those leading the way as sustainable and responsible investing goes mainstream. Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360 is now available in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook format wherever books are sold.